He pulled her from the wreckage. She repaid him with a $2 million check. The rain had been falling over Cedar Hollow for 3 days straight, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud and the lake behind. Logan Hale's property into something angrier than he'd ever seen it. He stood on his porch that morning with a cup of black coffee going cold in his hands, watching his 8-year-old son Micah chase a soggy tennis ball across the yard, and he thought, not for the first time, that this was enough. A quiet life, a boy who still laughed easily. A garage he used to run before his back gave out, now reduced to a hobby where he fixed up old trucks for neighbors, who paid him in cash and casseroles. It wasn't much. But after Rachel left 3 years ago, taking nothing but her suitcase and leaving nothing but a note on the kitchen counter, enough had become Logan's whole ambition. He didn't know that morning that the sky was about to fall into his life, literally. The sound came first, a tearing, shrieking whine that didn't belong to thunder or wind. Logan looked up in time to see a small private jet, silver and sleek, dropping at an angle no plane should ever drop, one wing already trailing black smoke. It cleared the tree line by what felt like inches and hit the lake, with a sound like the world cracking in half. Water exploded upward in a column he would remember for the rest of his life. Micah screamed. Logan didn't think. He was already running, boots slipping in the mud, adrenaline turning his ruined back into something that could still move. He hit the water without breaking stride, the cold slamming into his chest like a fist. The jet was sinking fast, nose already under, one door hanging open at a crooked angle. He swam harder than he had in 20 years, lungs burning. And when he reached the fuselage, he found a woman half conscious, trapped by a seatbelt that had jammed, water already at her collarbone. He didn't know her name. He didn't know she was worth more money than his entire town combined. He only knew she was drowning, and he still had 30 more seconds before the cabin filled completely. His hands shook as he worked the buckle, cutting his palm on torn metal, and when it finally gave, he pulled her out and up, kicking for the surface with everything he had left. They broke into the rain together, her coughing up lake water into his shoulder, and Logan swam them both to the muddy bank where Micah stood frozen, hands over his mouth, tears mixing with rain. He'd learn later was Elena Marchetti Cross, CEO of a biotech firm most people in Cedar Hollow had never heard of. On her way to a private meeting in Asheville, when a fuel line failure sent her jet down into a lake. Behind a stranger's house, she had a broken wrist, 2 cracked ribs, and a concussion that kept her in the local hospital for 4 days. Logan visited exactly once, mostly to return a shoe that had washed up near his dock, and he almost didn't go in, feeling foolish standing in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic, holding a single waterlogged loafer like an idiot. But she remembered his face before she remembered anything else about that day. And when she saw him in the doorway, she started crying in a way that embarrassed them both. "You didn't have to come back," she said. "You didn't have to almost die in my backyard," he said. And it startled a laugh out of her, wet and surprised, the kind of laugh that comes out sideways when someone's been holding their breath for days. He thought that would be the end of it. A strange, terrible morning. A story he'd tell at Micah's ball games for the rest of his life. But 2 weeks later, a black car eased up his gravel driveway, and a woman in a cream blazer stepped out holding an envelope. Inside was a check for $2 million, and a note in handwriting so careful it looked practiced. "There is no number that repays what you did. This is only so you never have to worry about numbers again. Thank you for pulling me back into my own life." Logan stood in his driveway holding that check like it might catch fire. $2 million. More money than he'd see in 6 lifetimes of fixing transmissions. He thought about Micah's college fund, about finally getting his back looked at by a real specialist, about the leak in the garage roof he'd patched with tarp for 2 winters running. He thought about all of it. And then, that same evening, he drove 90 minutes to the address printed at the bottom of the note. An office building in Asheville with her name etched in glass on the 14th floor, and he handed the check back to her assistant with a simple message. "Tell her I didn't pull her out of that water for a paycheck. Tell her I did it because that's what you do for another person. She can keep her money." He didn't expect to hear from her again after that. But 3 days later, Elena showed up at his garage in jeans and boots that still had the store tag, creased in at the ankle, clearly unused to wearing them, and she stood in his doorway, looking more nervous than she probably had in a boardroom in 15 years. "You can't just refuse $2 million, she said. "Watch me," Logan said, wiping grease off his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. "Then let me pay you a different way," she said. "Let me actually know you. Not as a headline, not as a rescue story I tell at dinner parties. Let me sit at your table and eat whatever you're making tonight. And let your son show me his cannonball into that same lake that almost killed me." Because apparently he's been bragging about it to anyone who'll listen. Logan almost laughed at the absurdity of a Fortune 500 CEO standing in his garage asking to be invited to dinner. like a kid new to the neighborhood. But there was something in her face, something stripped down and honest that money couldn't buy and hadn't bought. Not that day in the water and not now. So he said yes, mostly to see what she would do with a plate of his. Mediocre spaghetti and garlic bread that came from a bag. She came back the next week, and the week after that, Micah, who had never fully processed watching his father drag a woman out of a lake with his bare hands, adopted her almost instantly. The way children do when adults stop performing for them and just show up. Elena learned to bait a hook. She burned the first batch of cornbread she ever attempted and laughed about it harder than Logan had seen anyone laugh in years. She told him, one evening on the dock with her cast finally off her wrist, that she'd built her entire company from nothing after her father lost everything in the '08 crash, that she hadn't taken a real vacation in 11 years. That the day her jet went down was, strangely, the first time in over a decade she'd stopped, moving long enough to actually feel something. "I've built a $100 million company," she told him, "and I couldn't tell you the last time someone did something for me without wanting something back." "I don't want anything," Logan said. "I know," she said. "That's the whole problem. I don't know what to do with a person who doesn't want anything." Months passed the way seasons do when no one is counting them, slow and then suddenly gone. Elena scaled back her role at the company, hired a COO she trusted, started splitting her time between Asheville and Cedar Hollow. She paid quietly and without telling Logan until after the fact for the back surgery he'd been putting off for 3 years, calling in a favor from a surgeon she'd once helped fund through medical school. When Logan found out, he was furious for exactly 1 day, and then he wasn't, because he understood finally that this was her way of pulling someone out of the water too. Everyone needed saving from something. His had just been more visible. But the story doesn't stay simple because life rarely does. Elena's ex-business partner, a man named Griffin Voss, who'd been pushed out of the company 2 years prior amid accusations of financial misconduct that never quite stuck, resurfaced that autumn threatening a lawsuit, claiming the crash had been the result of sabotage maintenance records he intended to pin on Elena's leadership, to force a hostile buyout of company shares while she was distracted. For weeks, Elena disappeared into depositions and late-night calls with lawyers, the warmth in her face replaced by the old exhaustion Logan recognized from the woman, who'd once run a company like it, was the only thing keeping her alive. He watched her retreat, watched the light dim, and he understood with a sinking certainty that the version of Elena he'd fallen for might not survive contact with the version of her life she'd left behind. He almost let her go without a fight. That was the truth of it. He'd been left once before, and some old, bruised part of him expected it again. Expected the black car to roll up the driveway. One final time to say this. Had been a nice detour, but real. Life was calling her back to boardrooms and headlines where mechanics with muddy boots didn't belong. But Micah, in the blunt way only an 8-year-old can manage, asked him one night, "Are you going to let her drown again, Dad? Or are you going to go get her?" So Logan drove to Asheville a second time, to that same glass building, and rode the elevator to the 14th floor past assistants who clearly didn't know what to do with a man in a flannel shirt and work boots, striding toward the CEO's office uninvited. He found her staring out the window at the mountains, phone in hand, mid-sentence to a lawyer, and he simply stood in the doorway until she noticed him and hung up, without finishing her thought. "You once told me you didn't know what to do with someone who didn't want anything from you," Logan said. "I'm here to tell you I want something now. I want you to stop treating this thing, between us, like it's the fragile part of your life. You have to protect from the real world. It is the real world. It's the realest thing either of us has." Elena didn't cry the way she had in the hospital. This time it was quieter, steadier. The kind of tears that come when someone finally stops holding their breath. She told him the lawsuit was baseless, that her lawyers were confident, that Voss's own falsified records would bury him long before any court date arrived. And she admitted, in a voice smaller than the one she used in boardrooms, that she'd been terrified of losing Cedar Hollow, of losing him and Micah and the version of her own life that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings, more terrified of that than she'd ever been of drowning. The lawsuit collapsed 4 months later, exactly as her lawyers predicted, Voss's fraud exposed by the very documents he'd tried to weaponize. Elena stepped down from day-to-day operations entirely that spring, keeping a board seat and nothing more, and moved into the old Hutchins place 2 properties down from Logan's, close enough that Micah could ride his bike over on weekends, far enough that it never felt like she was taking anything that wasn't freely given. She never did convince Logan to take the $2 million. Instead, she quietly funded a scholarship in Cedar Hollow for kids whose parents worked with their hands the way Logan always had. Mechanics and welders and roofers who deserved a shot at something bigger, without ever having to almost die in a lake to get it. On the 1-year anniversary of the crash, They stood together on that same dock at sunset, Micah skipping stones nearby. And Elena told Logan that she used to think surviving the crash was the miracle. Now she understood the miracle had been what came after. The ordinary, unglamorous, deeply chosen life of showing up for people who never once asked what she was worth. Logan didn't say much back. He never did, not with words. He just took her hand, watched his son skip another stone across water that had once nearly swallowed them both, and let the quiet say what he'd always meant. That some things were worth more than money precisely because you could never write a check big enough to cover them, and the $2 million he refused had turned out to be nothing compared to what he ended up with anyway.